Well, welcome to the Catholic Reason, a radio production of St. Michael Radio, based in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, where we think through various claims made by the Catholic Church concerning issues of faith, morality, and culture, and provide reasons behind those claims. I'm Dr. Karlo Broussard, staff apologist and speaker for Catholic Answers at Catholic.com, and a member of the Chancery Evangelization team here at the Diocese of Tulsa in eastern Oklahoma. The Catholic Reason airs locally here in Tulsa every Thursday from 4 to 5 p.m. on St. Michael Catholic Radio, 94.9 and 102.9, and across the entire Oklahoma radio network of 15 stations, including 97.3 FM in Oklahoma City, 100.9 in Edmond, and 88.3 FM in Lawton. But you may be listening at a different time on your own local Catholic station outside Oklahoma, since the Catholic Reason is aired on other Catholic stations throughout the country. Regardless of where you are, I want to welcome you and thank you for joining me today. Note that you can download the show through whichever podcast platform that you use by subscribing to the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcast, and you can also access the archived episodes at karlobroussard.com under both the audio and video tab. I always mention in the introduction that there are three categories of issues that we look at on the Catholic Reason: faith, morality, and culture. Mostly we focus on faith, sometimes morality. In today's episode, I'd like to look at a cultural issue, namely the moral shame culture, which of course involves issues of morality. But because it's so prevalent within our culture, I think it's important that we reflect upon it. It's not a secret that we live in a culture where Christians are shamed for holding to certain beliefs that run up against and butt heads with, you might say, the widespread cultural moral code. And there are two elements of that moral code that I'd like to think through in today's episode. The first is thou shalt not impose. I'm sure you've heard that before. Don't impose your beliefs on me. Don't impose your morality on me. Christians are often criticized for quote-unquote imposing their beliefs on others when they voice their views and opinions on certain issues. The second element of the cultural moral code that we're going to look at today is thou shalt not be intolerant. I'm sure you've been charged with that before, or at least heard of that moral imperative within our culture. Christians are often criticized or shamed for being intolerant of other people's beliefs and lifestyle choices whenever they voice their opposition. Note that everything I say and share here in today's episode is found in written form in my book, The New Relativism, Unmasking the Philosophy of Today's Woke Moralists, published by Catholic Answers Press, and you can get that at shop.catholic.com. So let's start with the moral imperative, thou shalt not impose. The Collins Online Dictionary defines impose as follows, quote, if you impose your opinions or beliefs on other people, you try and make people accept them as a rule or as a model to copy. Now, the key verb here in this definition from Collins Online Dictionary is to make. For most in our culture, to make someone accept your belief means to persuade someone to believe what you believe. Now, if someone were to interpret to make as coercing somebody to believe what you believe, well, then of course we would reject that as well. But again, for most in our culture, to make someone accept your belief means simply to persuade them, to try and convince someone to believe what you believe. That's what they understand by impose in the moral imperative, thou shalt not impose. And this is something that we're going to take issue with. Take, for example, actress and comedian Melissa McCarthy. She touts this hands-off approach to persuading others to believe what you believe, calling it, quote-unquote, true equality. That was a buzzword for quite some time. In a video for Glamour, McCarthy is asked "What does true equality mean to you?" And here's what she answered. "True equality is when we're no longer asking what true equality is." It's when we don't think about it, she said. We don't think about color, sex, or gender, who's doing what. I think it's when, and again, the target is what is true equality? I think it's when everybody just worries about themselves. I look forward to knowing when that day is. For McCarthy, as well as others, so we'll see, the cultural moral code of not imposing beliefs on others takes the form of not persuading others. As McCarthy said, to just not think about it, let everybody to themselves. That would include trying to convince other people to believe and adopt what you believe, i.e. impose, according to the cultural definition. Others who promote this idea do so for deeper reasons. Notice McCarthy never gave any reasons why she thinks we need to have this hands-off or even minds-off approach and let people to themselves without trying to think about and ask all these important questions. Consider, for example, Alan Clifton, a Christian who's the co-founder of Forward Progressives and the author of the popular Right Off a Cliff column, states in his article, "Organized Religion, a Tool for Ignorance, Power, and Control." Quote, If everyone kept their beliefs private, there it is, keep your beliefs private, as they should be, and didn't judge others who believe differently, can you imagine how much more peaceful the world would be? Notice his appeal to peace is the reason why he thinks we should keep our beliefs private. The implication of that is don't go and persuade others lest you disturb the peace. Blogger Donovan Jensen tones down the rhetoric a bit, but nevertheless exemplifies the same prevalent view. The condition for human happiness is not to impose your beliefs, and impose meaning to share and persuade others. In Jensen's article, Communication, 3 Reasons Not to Impose Your Values on Others, Jensen focuses on relationships. Here's what he argues. The more we try to force others to share our values, the more disjointed and broken our bonds become. The harder you try to make someone else conform, the more damaged the relationship will be. Now, as I read Jensen, when he says force others and make someone, if he means by that coercion, well, then of course we agree. That's going to destroy relationships. But seemingly, as I read the article, by force and make, he seems to imply, in unison with this cultural idea of simply persuading others, to try and convince others to believe what you believe. Now, what is Jensen's solution to the problem? Here he goes. We have much to gain by simply understanding their view of the world. Listen to people's wants and desires and help them achieve those than to impose your own. There it is. So just listen to other people's views, help them to actualize their desires, whatever they are, rather than impose your own. So that would seem to imply thou shalt not persuade others to believe what you believe. So the question becomes, how should we respond to this way of thinking that's embedded within our modern culture? Well, let's begin our refutation by offering a few lines of response to the moral imperative itself, independent of the specific reasons for the moral imperative. Just some responses to the moral imperative itself. Then we'll address some specific reasons that people give to justify it, say like Clifton and Jensen. All right, so a first way to respond is to point out that those who assert the thou shalt not impose imperative live by a double standard. We could simply ask them, are you expecting me to abide by this code of life? What's the code of life? Thou shalt not impose. Are you expecting me to abide by that code? If they're to be consistent with their desire to uphold the code, well, then they'd have to say yes. But if they say yes, then necessarily they would be saying that we should accept what they believe. Namely, that it is imperative that we not impose our views on others. That's what they believe, right? We shouldn't impose our view on others. And they're expecting that we accept that view. But according to the definition of impose that this moral commandment employs, the moral exhortation itself, that we should not impose our views on others, is an imposition of belief. To say that we need to live by this moral precept is to do the very thing they say we ought to avoid. Why are they exempt from the moral imperative? They're saying we cannot, quote unquote, impose, i.e. persuade others to adopt our beliefs, but yet in as much as they make that command, they are, quote unquote, imposing their belief upon us, trying to persuade us to adopt their own view. So it's a bit of a double standard here. Not a bit, but a big double standard. Now, another inconsistency with this absolute is that it's usually selectively applied to things like religious beliefs or morals rather than other things. It's hardly ever held up, say, as a standard for living when it comes to science. Now, before we go even further to that, I'm looking at the clock here and we're coming up on our first break. So on the other side of the break, we're going to come back to this particular response of the selectivity of this moral imperative. Friends, I'm Dr. Karlo Broussard. You're listening to The Catholic Reason. Stay tuned because there's more to come on the other side of the break. Well, welcome back, my friends, to The Catholic Reason. I'm Dr. Karlo Broussard. In today's episode, we are looking at the topic of how to survive the moral shame culture. There are two elements of the moral shame culture that we're going to look at today, one of which we began to already look at in our first segment, namely, thou shalt not impose. Now, on the surface, that seems right. Yeah, we shouldn't be going and imposing our beliefs on others. If you mean by impose to coerce others or psychologically manipulate them and emotionally manipulate them and use force, etc. But that's not what the modern culture interprets impose to be. By impose, the modern culture thinks we ought not to persuade others or try and convince others to believe what we believe. And we looked at a few cultural examples of that. A comedian and a few others online articles where the general idea is that we need to leave people to themselves and stop trying to convince them. And we have sort of the general imperative, and then a few have given reasons to keep peace, to foster relationships, etc. Now, before our break, I began to offer a couple of responses to this moral imperative, at least responding to the moral imperative itself, generally speaking. First of all, it falls prey to a double standard. Inasmuch as they exhort us to not persuade others to adopt our beliefs, they're trying to persuade us to adopt their belief. So it's not for thee, but for me. It's a double standard. We can't try and persuade others, but yet they can. And that's a problem, and that's something that is important to point out in conversations. And then before the break, I was beginning to articulate a second response, and that is there's an inconsistency with this absolute, yet again, in that it's usually selectively applied to things like religious beliefs or morals, and it's hardly ever held up as a standard for living when it comes to science, for example. Imagine a student saying to his physics professor, "Hey, look, doc, you have your views on the laws of thermodynamics, and that's great. You do you, but don't impose them on the rest of the class." That's absurd, right? Why, then, does this commandment bind us when it comes to religious beliefs and morals? After all, religious and philosophical claims are every bit as much about the nature of reality as scientific claims about gravity, energy, or the climate. To say, without a principled reason, that the moral imperative binds in one category of belief but not in another is to enact an arbitrary standard. So first of all, the moral imperative is guilty of a double standard, and then secondly, it's enacting an arbitrary standard. So two strikes against this modern moral imperative of thou shalt not impose. Now, a third general response is that we can't abide by this moral code of not imposing our beliefs, interpreted as not persuading others to our beliefs, because truth matters. Truth is perfective of our human nature, and thus is essential to authentic human happiness. And we cannot turn a blind eye to this. As human beings, rational animals, we're made for the truth. Our intellects are naturally ordered to know truth. Inasmuch as truth is a natural end or goal, purpose of our intellects, truth thereby is perfective of our intellects, since whatever is a natural end or goal of a thing's power is perfective of that power. Now, the perfection of our intellects constitutes the perfection of our whole selves. There can be no perfection of a power without some degree of perfection for the thing to which the power belongs. Since our perfection as a human being is constitutive of our happiness, and truth contributes to our perfection, well, then it follows that truth and the knowledge thereof is necessary for authentic human happiness. This being the case, it's clear that persuasion to the truth is something that we ought to do rather than not ought to do, right? Rather than the thou shalt not, it's a thou shalt. To say that we should never persuade another to assent to truth, at least to that which I perceive to be truth, is to say that people shouldn't acquire a good that's perfective of their nature. I'm going to repeat that. The modern moral imperative says, thou shalt not persuade others to adopt what you believe. Well, what we believe to be true, okay? So let's say we're right in that belief, but yet we still must leave others to what they believe. Well, to say that we should never persuade another to assent to truth is to say that people should not acquire a good that's perfective of their nature. And to say that, well, is to wish that people not be happy. Now, where's the love of humanity in that? The irony is that this is, in fact, a kind of violence. The very thing the modern moral code of thou shalt not impose is trying to avoid. So, in demanding that we live according to the moral code of thou shalt not impose, people try to avoid doing harm to others. But insofar as they demand that we are hands and minds off of other people's beliefs, we're actually doing harm to them because we're not leading them to the truth, which is perfective of their nature, which in turn means truth is necessary for human happiness. So much for our general response to the moral imperative. Let's now move to some specific reasons given to justify the absolute. First, we'll take Clifton's reason, if you remember the individual from the first segment that we quoted, that peace on earth requires us to keep our beliefs to ourselves. Okay, so he appeals to peace and preserving peace as the reason why we should not try and persuade others to believe what we believe. Of course, this reason too amounts to imposing the commandment not to impose. But moreover, it has another problem. It's self-defeating. I assume that Clifton generally is a civil human being. And I also assume that he carries over such civility when he, quote unquote, imposes by mere persuasion, for example, perhaps by gentle incentivization. His belief that we should keep to ourselves and not try to persuade others. So whenever he's doing that, he's being civil, he's being gentle, he's being kind. But if it's thus possible for him to quote unquote, impose or persuade a belief about a belief without it leading to violence, well, then his rationale for not persuading is thereby falsified. As he illustrates, given his civility and gentleness, you can persuade someone that what you believe is true without people getting hurt after all. You can preserve peace while at the same time trying to persuade others to believe. And if the fundamental reason for embracing an idea is falsified, well, then we should no longer embrace it. So Clifton himself illustrates the counterfactual of his claim. He thinks that in order to preserve, you cannot preserve peace if you try and persuade others to believe what you believe. But yet he's doing that very thing of preserving peace when trying to persuade us to adopt what he believes. So it's self-defeating. Clifton's way of thinking is also problematic because it commits a non sequitur. That's just Latin for it doesn't follow, which is a logical fallacy in which the conclusion doesn't follow from the premise. We can begin to intuit that something's awry with this reasoning of Clifton by comparing it with something else that leads to violent conflict. Take, for example, we could ask Clifton we could ask him, should we give up on sharing our beliefs with others because doing so often leads, let me repeat that. If we should give up on sharing our beliefs with others because doing so often leads to violent conflict, well then, shouldn't we also give up on the idea of acquiring our own land? Since that has often led and still does lead to violent conflict. The conclusion we shouldn't persuade others to adopt our beliefs no more follows from the premise persuading others to adopt our beliefs leads to violence than the conclusion we should give up on the idea of acquiring our own land follows from the premise such activity often leads to violent conflict. Kings and countries have fought and still fight over disputed land. But almost no one thinks that this means we should abolish private property. Similarly, just because individuals sometimes fight in the name of their belief, it doesn't follow that we should abolish persuading others to accept our ideas. So by comparing the logic to the land example and the violence that is often ensuing over land, we can intuit that something is awry with this reasoning. The conclusion we should get rid of persuading others to believe what we believe doesn't follow from the premise. It often sometimes leads to violent conflict. Now, not only can we intuit that Clifton's way of thinking is fallacious, we can also provide reasons why it is so, why the conclusion doesn't follow from the premise. But before we do that, we need to set the stage by exposing an assumption that Clifton and others like him make in this argument, namely that all violence is bad and that there's no room for a distinction between just and unjust violence. Clifton only speaks of violence in general. He doesn't specify particular instances of violence that perhaps could be analyzed as to whether they are just or not. And this is important because we all recognize that there are some instances of violence that are justified, maybe like in defensive war, or apprehending violent criminals. But before we go on further with this idea, we're going to have to take a pause because I'm coming up on a break. Stay tuned. You're listening to The Catholic Reason. More on the other side. Well, welcome back, my friends, to The Catholic Reason. In today's episode, we are thinking through how we might respond to certain elements of the moral shame culture. One particular way in which Christians are often shamed is thou shalt not impose, meaning we shouldn't be trying to persuade others and convince others to adopt what we believe. The implication being that we should just leave people to themselves and the world would be a better place, so it's said. A couple of reasons being that in order to preserve peace, we need to avoid trying to persuade others. And then we need to, in order to preserve relationships, we need to avoid persuading others. And the world's just going to be a better place. Now, before our last break, I was beginning to respond. So far, we've responded to the moral imperative in general, thou shalt not impose. There were a few general responses to the moral imperative itself. But before our last break, we started responding to the specific reasons given for thou shalt not impose or persuade others to believe what you believe. One of which is that we need to be preserving peace. And I argued that for those who would demand that we avoid persuading others are doing so with civility and gentleness and kindness and in a sense of peace. So thereby illustrating that you can try and persuade others to believe what you believe and still keep the peace. And so it's self-defeating. And then also, too, I was explaining how there's some fallacious reasoning going on there that we can intuit. We would never say that we should reject the pursuit of private property simply because sometimes that pursuit involves violent conflict. So too, we should not reject persuading others to believe what we believe just because sometimes it might be surrounded and involve violent conflict. Now, not only, as I was explaining before the break, not only can we intuit that this way of thinking is fallacious, we can also provide reasons why it is so. But as I stated, before we do that, we need to set the stage by exposing an assumption that most people make when they make this argument, namely that all violence is bad and that there's no room for a distinction between just and unjust violence. The gentleman Clifton that I was speaking of earlier only speaks of violence in general, and most do. They don't specify particular instances of violence that maybe perhaps could be analyzed to see whether they were just or not. And this is important because we all recognize that there are some instances of violence that are justified, maybe in defensive war, for example, or in apprehending violent criminals. That's violent, but we recognize most times that force is proportionate to the crime and thus is justified. We even recognize that there may be instances where violence is justified to defeat an erroneous belief, such it was in part to defeat the ideology of Nazism or to destroy the institution of slavery in the U.S. Civil War. Even if the violence ensuing from it were unjust, it still wouldn't follow that we should always avoid persuading others to adopt our beliefs. Not every person who tries to persuade others thinks he must do so by violent coercion. Most attempts to persuade do not result in violence. And so we may view unjust violence that ensues from persuasion as a perversion of the desire to persuade. So we may encounter violence in the name of persuading others to adopt a belief, but that doesn't automatically justify this modern moral absolute, thou shalt not impose, when impose is understood as persuading others to adopt our beliefs. There may be more to the story, right? Namely, the lack of justice in the violence, the unjust violence, which is a perversion of the desire to persuade others. Now, the other reason that was given before by Jensen for why we shouldn't persuade others to adopt our beliefs is that it will destroy our relationships with others. And of course, this is very similar to the attempt to preserve peace, but it's focusing more so on the relationships. And of course, that merits distinct answers in response. Jensen's reason is also self-defeating. In the very act of telling us that we shouldn't persuade others to adopt our beliefs, he's trying to persuade us to adopt his belief that we shouldn't persuade others to adopt our beliefs. But putting aside the double standard, notice that in his attempt to persuade us, no relationships have been broken. We didn't even have a relationship with Jensen in the first place. And even if we were to say that we have at least a kind of relationship with him simply by reading his words in his article, no damage to that relationship has been inflicted. Since Jensen's attempt to persuade us to adopt his belief didn't lead to damaged relationships, well then it follows that his justification for embracing the thou shalt not impose imperative fails. So it's self-defeating. He is actually doing what he says cannot be done, namely preserve relationships whenever you're trying to persuade others to adopt your belief. He's given us a good example of how it can be done. And so we can imitate him. Secondly, Jensen's claim is factually false. In the real world, people try to persuade others to adopt their beliefs all the time without it leading to damaged relationships. In fact, often just the opposite happens. Sometimes the persuasion is successful, and two people build a deeper relationship through their newfound agreement. Other times, the persuasion is not successful, but through frank and honest communication, the two people build greater mutual respect. And I and all the apologists who work at Catholic Answers have experienced both of these many times. Success in the persuasion and relationships follow. Lack of success in the persuasion, but a general mutual respect. So it's simply not true that all attempts to persuade damage relationships, or even that persuasion on the whole has a net effect of damaging relationships. This being the case, Jensen's reason to not persuade others to adopt what you believe is not persuasive enough to adopt the moral imperative, thou shalt not impose. So, this modern moral imperative of thou shalt not impose our beliefs on others, which is just code for don't attempt to persuade others of your beliefs, fails as an adequate code to live by. The code itself is self-defeating when applied to life. The reasons for the code aren't reasonable. And as we've said, since human happiness matters, persuasion to the truth matters. And we ought to employ that endeavor of trying to persuade others to what we think is true, simply because we love them and we will what's good for them. Okay, so let's now turn to the moral imperative within our modern culture, thou shalt not be intolerant. This is a common charge made of Christians when we voice our opposition to, say, certain lifestyle choices. Instances of this charge within the culture are numerous, but one that got some special attention just a few years ago, I guess now about 7 years ago, involved two members of the U.S. national women's soccer team. In a 2019 tweet, backup goaltender Ashlyn Harris blasted her teammate Jalen Hinkle, a devout Christian, as intolerant and homophobic. And these two are on the national women's soccer team. What did Hinkle do that made Harris so upset? Well, actually, it's what she didn't do. Hinkle was apparently intolerant, quote unquote, because 2 years prior to the charge in 2017, she refused to wear the LGBTQ Pride team jersey, citing her Christian convictions as the reason. Hinkle thought it was wrong to wear the jersey and celebrate those lifestyle choices, so she withdrew from the matches in which the national team wore the jerseys. But what did Harris mean by intolerant when she charges Hinkle of being intolerant? For Harris and others who think like her, tolerance, the positive command there, we ought to be tolerant. Tolerance means that we must accept and celebrate everyone's lifestyle choices as equal and valid, especially the lifestyle choices celebrated by the LGBTQ plus movement. And failure to do so implies that some lifestyles are morally superior or inferior to others. And this is absolutely impermissible within this modern moral imperative. One might call this view egalitarian tolerance, namely, all lifestyle choices are equal and valid. Egalitarian tolerance is not new. We saw it codified in 1995 by the United Nations Declaration of Principles of Tolerance, which states, quote, tolerance involves the rejection of dogmatism and absolutism. A year later, the National Lambda Chi Alpha Fraternity summed up its view on tolerance, quote, the definition of the new tolerance is that every individual's beliefs, lifestyle, and persuasion of truth claims are equal. There is no hierarchy of truth. Your beliefs and my beliefs are equal. And of course, that would include your lifestyle, my lifestyle is equal. Pope St. John Paul II identified this egalitarian approach to beliefs in his 1998 encyclical Fides et Ratio, where he writes, recent times have seen the rise to prominence of various doctrines which tend to devalue even the truth which had been judged certain. A legitimate plurality of positions has yielded to an undifferentiated pluralism based upon the assumption that all positions are equally valid, which is one of today's most widespread symptoms of the lack of confidence in truth. So, now that we have a clear picture of what modern culture means by tolerance and the command that we ought to obey it, namely accept everyone's lifestyle choices as equal and valid, the question becomes, how should we respond to this imperative? And that you're going to have to wait for the other side of the break. Stay tuned, more to come. Well, welcome back to our last and final segment of today's episode of The Catholic Reason, where we are assessing certain challenges made to Christians within our moral shame culture. Christians are often shamed for, quote unquote, imposing their beliefs on others, which simply means they're shamed for trying to persuade and convince others to adopt their Christian worldview. We offered some responses to that moral imperative, generally speaking, showing how it is employing a double standard, an arbitrary standard, and not providing reasons why we should reject this modern moral imperative and not live by that moral code. And then also Christians are challenged. And then, of course, we responded to some of the specific reasons for that moral imperative, showing that we can preserve peace and relationships when we try and persuade others to adopt our beliefs. And then Christians are often challenged as well, are often shamed for being, quote unquote, intolerant. But of course, that raises the question, what does the culture mean by tolerance? That we ought to be tolerant. And as I indicated before our last break, within our modern culture, tolerance is understood as accepting and celebrating everybody's beliefs and or lifestyle choices as equal and valid. What I called egalitarian, or what some philosophers might call an egalitarian tolerance. Now, that's our target. So the question becomes, what can we say in response to this egalitarian tolerance and this demand for Christians to accept everybody's lifestyle choices as equal and valid? Well, let's go back to the dispute between Hinkle and Harris that I brought up earlier in our previous segment. Consider the belief that we must accept and celebrate everyone's life choices as equal and valid. That is what Harris was basically saying to Hinkle whenever she shames her for being, quote unquote, intolerant. Well, the question becomes, what about Hinkle's choice, and of course our choice, to live her life in a way that doesn't show support for the LGBTQ plus lifestyle choices? Shouldn't that lifestyle choice be considered equally valid and celebrated? Hinkle's lifestyle choice to not celebrate LGBTQ plus lifestyle choices, according to this tolerance, modern tolerance of equality, Hinkle's choice should be celebrated just as equally as Harris's choice, or the lifestyle choices associated with the LGBTQ plus community. If Harris were to follow her own logic, well, then she'd have to say yes. If she were to follow the logic of tolerance, she would have to accept Hinkle's choice as equal and valid. But of course, that would undermine her initial criticism of Hinkle. So she can't do that. She can't accept Hinkle's choice as equal and valid. Now, in order to avoid subverting her own initial criticism of Hinkle, Harris has to reject Hinkle's life choice as equally good. But of course, that means Harris has to be, quote unquote, intolerant, according to her definition of tolerance. So Harris can't criticize Hinkle and follow her own moral code at the same time. Therefore, Harris ends up running afoul of the very moral code that she claimed Hinkle was violating. Namely, not accepting everybody's lifestyle choices as equal and valid. Now, another problem with this way of thinking is that it demands, in theory, that we celebrate and accept life choices that we intuitively recognize are not good. Remember, the command is accept everybody's lifestyle choices as equal and valid. Well, for example, if we were to live by this understanding of tolerance, we would have to accept and celebrate the life choices of those who choose to live their lives as serial killers, thieves, or rapists. Since almost no one thinks this, a critic might respond, well, of course we shouldn't tolerate, i.e. accept and celebrate, life choices that involve murder, thievery, and rape. Those clearly aren't good life choices because they harm people. The life choices associated with, say, same-sex sexual activity and romantic relationships among members of the same sex do not harm anyone. But is not a safe space for a modern tolerance advocate, but let me just say it like this. This is not a safe space for a modern tolerance advocate, because the principle undergirding this counter is that all moral choices are good if they don't cause harm, which means not all lifestyle choices are equal and valid after all. So you end up gutting the modern understanding of tolerance, of meaning. This principle brings us to a more fundamental problem with this modern moral imperative. It sidesteps the real question. Are the lifestyle choices associated with the LGBTQ plus movement morally good? As I argue in my book, if the life choices associated with the LGBTQ plus community, such as same-sex sexual activity, so-called sex reassignment surgery, dressing and living as a woman when you're a man, or as a man when you're a woman, are not good for us insofar as we're human beings. If that's the case, well, then they would be harmful, inasmuch as they would harm our moral character. And if such life choices were morally harmful, well, then we shouldn't accept or celebrate them, even if civil authorities might tolerate them, lest their legal censure bring about a greater evil. So we can see that the logic of the modern moral imperative of thou shalt not be intolerant or thou shalt be tolerant, according to the modern definition of tolerance, of egalitarian tolerance, that logic demands that we accept and celebrate all lifestyle choices. And the moment an advocate of this modern moral imperative tries to restrict the celebration and acceptance of lifestyle choices, maybe to only those that do not cause harm, well, then you gut the meaning of the modern view of tolerance, saying that, well, I guess we don't have to accept all lifestyle choices as equal and valid. And so that just raises the question, well, which lifestyle choices are moral and not? That's the key question. Now, there's another critique, and this will be the last thing that I'll say in response to the intolerance charge, and that is, it involves a distortion of the true meaning of tolerance. If we define tolerance in the egalitarian sense, then we must reject this modern moral code, because we cannot go along with egalitarian tolerance for the reasons that I've been articulating so far. However, if we define tolerance differently, according to what philosopher John F. Canazes calls fraternal tolerance, well, then we have a new absolute we can promote. Thou shalt be tolerant. Fraternal tolerance respects a person's freedom to hold to his belief and even to make certain lifestyle choices that one may consider to be immoral and wrong. On this view of tolerance, you can't be labeled intolerant for disapproving, for example, of the life choices celebrated by the LGBTQ plus movement, because disapproving of life choices necessarily belongs to the essence of fraternal tolerance. It's part and parcel of it. According to this definition of tolerance, Hinkle was being tolerant of Harris and lifestyle choices of LGBTQ plus community. She didn't demand that the rest of the team conform to her view. She tolerated her teammates' choice to wear the uniform she objected to. She disapproved of what those jerseys stood for, but she expressed her disapproval in a way that was kind and respectful, simply withdrawing from the matches, in contrast with Harris's approach, who's going after her in a at least verbally violent way. Taking this view of tolerance doesn't mean that we or society don't believe there is absolute truth and goodness to defend. Rather, in the words of philosopher J. Budziszewski in his article Tired of Being Called a Morality Cop and Other Bad Names, we love truth and goodness too much to defend them in the wrong way. Fraternal tolerance, again, in Budziszewski's words, doesn't mean tolerating everything bad or false in every way. It means knowing which bad and false things to put up with, in what ways and to what degrees and on which occasions. The reason for this nuanced tolerance, according to Budziszewski, is that some ways of resisting evil are injurious to the good, and certain ways of resisting error are injurious to the truth. So take, for example, the tolerance of heretics. Heresy is, without a doubt, false and thereby harmful, since we're made for the truth. Yet, it's reasonable to think that violent coercion to get someone to renounce heresy would only perpetrate further harm and falsehood. Faith is by its nature voluntary, and so for someone to reject heresy involuntarily and embrace the truth wouldn't be faith. Same-sex sexual activity provides us with another example. That behavior is absolutely contrary to the good of human beings, but because it willfully thwarts the natural end of our sexual powers. But it's reasonable to think that to police such behavior throughout our society and to ensure that it's not tolerated, that would cause more harm than good, because we'd be violating the principle of privacy. Here's Budziszewski one last time in his article, The Illusion of Moral Neutrality. When the evil that suppression engenders equals or exceeds the evil that it prevents, we ought to put up with the thing in question instead of suppressing it. There is a difference between social tolerance and social approval. The latter does not entail the former. The modern absolute of thou shalt not be intolerant has conflated the two, demanding social approval in the name of social tolerance. So once this mask of egalitarian tolerance is lifted and we understand true fraternal tolerance, we know which path forward we should take. Well, my friends, that's all the time I have for today's episode of The Catholic Reason. We looked at these two elements of the modern moral shame culture that Christians are often alleged to be imposing and alleged to be intolerant, but we have seen that nothing is further from the truth. Well, my friends, I'll talk to you again next week. Tell a friend, and thanks for listening today. God bless.